Okay, so welcome again to this week's installment of the Center for Ethics, Law, and Technology speaker series, affectionately known as Philosophy 205. And this week we're excited to bring up Ryan Jenkins from Cal Poly, and he has been teaching there for a number of years, philosophy of technology, philosophy of science, different philosophy of warfare class. So we're going to have a really interesting talk today on autonomous weapons and ethics, which is a very important subject that we're going to have to deal with. If you can't get enough of this, today at 5:30 I will be giving a lecture in the War and Peace lecture series on a similar topic. So it's all robot weapons today. That's my mistake. So it's going to be exciting. Ryan works in the what was it again?
Ethics and Emerging Science.
Ethics and Emerging Science. Yeah, I kept wanting to say Ethics and Emerging Technology. Ethics and Emerging Science group at Cal Poly, where they're lucky enough to have a whole bunch of professors working on these topics, and they've had some really stellar and exciting publications out of this group. It's very similar to the group that we have here, but ours is more focused on ethics and law. So, very exciting. I hope you can help me in welcoming Ryan Jenkins.
Thanks. Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Solons, for having me up here, having me into your beautiful campus. He's right that the subject of my talk today is going to be the social and political implications of autonomous weapons. These are weapons that are capable of targeting and engaging human targets without human oversight. So, affectionately called killer robots sometimes. When you hear people talking about killer robots, this is what they're worried about. And the angle that I wanted to come at this from was from the angle of engineering ethics. So if you've been paying attention to the technology press recently, you've probably seen a tremendous amount of controversy aimed at companies like Google and Amazon, and even Microsoft got pulled into this somehow, where their employees are starting to ask, what kind of projects are we building, and are they morally justified projects? So Google got into a lot of trouble for a project called Project Maven. That was a contract they took with the Pentagon to help develop an artificial intelligence system to identify targets in drone surveillance footage. And a lot of people looked at this and they said, well, classifying objects in drone footage is the first step towards being able to tell between things that are humans and things that are not. And that's the first step towards being able to distinguish between things that are friendly humans and things that are enemy humans. And you can see why people were worried. People were worried that Project Maven, the project that Google undertook with the Pentagon, put us on the road to autonomous weapons. So you've seen a lot of articles in the popular press examining this emerging controversy. And then you've seen responses from people. The Washington Post, Silicon Valley should stop ostracizing the military. And just about a week ago, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, came out firing against Google and saying that Google and their employees are mistaken for getting upset about working with the Pentagon. Bezos said, America's a great country and it needs to be defended. What I want to do in this talk is I want to raise some questions that engineers might find morally relevant when they're considering whether to take on projects for the military, like Project Maven and like autonomous weapons. Some of you in this room might be in this position someday very soon. You might be in the position where you're asked by your employer or your boss to take on a project working for the Pentagon. And the question that I want to put to you is, what will you say? And I want to help you think about this by giving you some questions to consider, a framework to consider, and by illustrating some things that you might not have thought about. My motivating quote comes from Langdon Winner, who's probably my favorite philosopher of technology. He says there's a tendency in our engineering professions not to see the kind of work they do as involved with serious moral questions. And he says, convinced that technology is merely neutral, and that somehow the important questions will be raised by someone else, many engineers seem unwilling to talk about ethical concerns. Now, he goes on to say that this is not a feature solely of our engineering professions, but that in a lot of different sectors in society, we've started to see ourselves less and less as individual moral agents and citizens of a free society, and instead we start to see ourselves as these parts of large corporate bodies that gradually eliminate the individual's need to think. This is a very stirring and a very challenging quote. And what Winner is saying here, and what I want to pick up on, is that we need to recapture this sense of ourselves as moral agents and citizens of a free society, rather than people who will do what they're told and then be content to think the important questions will be raised by somebody else. Now, I have just one claim that I'm not going to defend. The claim that I'm not going to defend is that a good engineer considers the possible consequences of their actions. I'm not going to defend this because I think that every engineer already accepts this. I think that to deny this would be pretty obviously false, that you can be a good engineer without thinking at all about the consequences of your actions. And I also think that it would be irresponsible. Now, the difficulty, of course, is determining which consequences engineers are responsible for anticipating. So what I want to do is sketch some reasons why military contracts for the Pentagon, might be particularly problematic. And when we're thinking about the consequences that we have to consider, I want to take this quote from Lewis Mumford as being illustrative. Mumford says, my own students back at Cal Poly get sick of this quote because I find a reason to bring it up nearly every class. What Mumford says is, the machine can't be divorced from its larger social pattern, for it's this pattern that gives it meaning and purpose. So what's the larger social pattern that we're considering? And what kinds of reasons does it give engineers when they're thinking about the ethics of what they do, and whether ultimately to take on something like autonomous weapons? Now, in that quote from Langdon Winner, the first thing that he laments is that there's a widespread view that technology is merely neutral. This view is very popular in Western civilization, and it's very popular outside of a philosophy classroom. But in a philosophy of technology classroom, this is probably the first view that will come under attack, because it's been viciously assailed for hundreds of years, or at least a solid 150 years or so, by philosophers of technology. And they've pointed out many ways in which technologies are not just neutral tools, but they can affect the nature of an activity, and they can affect the way that we pursue our goals. So here's what I mean. Rather than merely getting us from A to B, instead, using a tool can change the nature of the B that we accomplish. Let me give you a rather mundane example of this. Let's start with a can opener. Can opener seems like a neutral tool, doesn't have any moral qualities. Right? We can't judge it as morally good or morally bad. It just sits there on the table. It doesn't do anything by itself. What does it help us do? It helps us get food. Okay, fair enough. Very easy to tell a story about how the can opener is just a tool. But when we dig into it and think a little bit more about the way that a can opener encourages us to accomplish a task, what we see is that it can actually push us in various directions, that it can endorse certain ways of accomplishing this task and rule out other ways. So let me show how that is. A can opener isn't just a tool that helps us get food, but when we use a can opener, it changes the kind of food we get. It endorses certain kinds of food, and it eliminates other kinds of food from our diet. What are some examples of this? Think of the kind of food you get when you use a can opener. It endorses longevity, preservation, right? You're opening a can. It endorses foods that have been preserved. Things that have come from far away. Things that can come from the southern hemisphere, right? So we've obliterated the connection between our diet and the seasons. And it endorses mass production. These are the kinds of values that we find in a society where can openers are common. Notice this is not the only way that we might have a relationship to our food. Think of the opposite of each of these goals. So instead of longevity and preservation, you can imagine experiences that are ephemeral or temporary. Rather than things that come from far away, think about the farm-to-table movement. Think about the local food movement. And rather than things that have been mass-produced, think about unique or artisanal experiences with food. A can opener gives us all the things on the left, and it takes away all the things on the right. So what do can openers tell us about autonomous weapons? What do they tell us about working with the Pentagon? Even for some goals that seem totally unimpeachable, morally good, the way that we construct our tools can change the way that we accomplish those goals. Take a goal that's totally admirable, that no one would criticize. The goal of identifying terrorists. When it comes to military ethics, there's probably no more important distinction, there's no more important task than distinguishing between these two kinds of people. The people on the left, combatants, soldiers, legitimate targets. In military ethics, we say the people who are liable to harm, the people who have done something to make themselves worthy targets of harm. On the right, we have civilians, non-combatants, illegitimate targets, take whatever you want. And the most important thing for a military to do is to be able to discriminate successfully between the people on the left and the people on the right. Now, when it comes to a traditional state-based army, like the United States' army, it's pretty clear to know who the people are who are legitimate targets. The Red Cross tries to help us here. The Red Cross says you're only permitted to target people who are carrying out or organizing combat operations. People who are commanding or carrying out combat operations. Now, when the military looks like this is an actual picture of the United States' organizational chart from the Navy in World War II. You see some names here that you recognize. Douglas MacArthur's in there somewhere. It's pretty easy to know who's commanding, who's carrying out combat operations. Pretty straightforward. Only this is not the enemy that we face. This is the enemy that we face for the last 18 years or so at least. This is a map of a terrorist network. This is an actual map of a portion of Al-Qaeda's terrorist network. In the middle, the spoke in the upper left is Mohammed Atta, the quote-unquote ringleader of 9/11. These are the terrorists that organized and carried out 9/11. Now the problem is, when you're fighting an enemy that looks like this, when you're fighting a non-state army, it's very difficult to know who are the people who are commanding and carrying out combat operations. If we had a nice, neat organizational chart, we just aim for the people at the top. But we can't do that here. What we get is something messy, something horizontal. We get a network of connections that's very complicated. Now, the United States has a way of figuring this out. They use a technique called social network analysis. And what that lets the Army do is take a network like a terrorist network, and then find out which of the nodes, which of the people in that network are most crucial to the network's operation. And the idea is this. If we were fighting a traditional army, we would just decapitate the army. We'd aim for the people at the top. If we're fighting a non-state army, though, it's not easy to tell who's quote-unquote at the top. What we get is this messy network of interconnected spokes and hubs and nodes. So instead, we aim for the most crucial nodes in the network. We aim for the people who seem to be most important, most integral to the functioning of that terrorist network. The Army uses a technique called eigenvector centrality. For all the computer scientists in the room, this might ring some bells for you. Eigenvector centrality is a technique whereby nodes are weighted by the number of connections they have to nodes that themselves have many connections. That sounds complicated, but it's actually the same method that Google used when they designed their PageRank algorithm. So way back in the early days of Google, when you do a Google search, it gives you, a billion results. How does Google determine which of these results are most important? It looks at pages that have a lot of links from other pages that themselves have a lot of links. Google's PageRank algorithm was borrowed from academia. If I'm searching for a paper that I want to read, and it comes up from an author I've never heard of, how do I know whether this paper is reputable? Well, I can see who cites the paper. And if the paper is cited by people who are themselves famous, then that's a way of knowing that the paper is reputable. So the paper is cited by people who themselves have many citations. For Google PageRank, the page is linked to by pages that themselves have many links. This tells you it's a reputable page. And the United States military says, let's do the same thing with terrorists. People who have many links from people who themselves share a lot of links must be important. And then the idea is that by killing an important node, you would disrupt this terrorist network. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, an operation that seems totally objective, gather the data, run the analysis, see what it says, is actually shot through with subjective human judgments. Judgments like, what are these connections and how do I know if they're morally important? When I see a link between two people in that network, what is that link? Is it a handshake? Is it a phone call? Is it a meeting? Did they exchange a package? Did they travel together somewhere? All of those things communicate different kinds of information about the link, the quote-unquote link that these people share. And moreover, eigenvector centrality is only one measure of the strength of nodes in a network. So we take a process that seems perfectly objective, and it turns out that there's a lot of subjective judgment built into it. And the subjective judgments about what counts as a link and how we know which nodes are central, those human judgments are going to end up changing who we think the important members of this terrorist network are. The ultimate concern is that we end up targeting the wrong people. So remember, the primary task of a military is to distinguish between people who are legitimate targets and people who are not. But think about some of the people that might get wrapped up in a social network analysis. Some of these people might engage in their work only periodically. They might be people in mere support functions. So think about someone who's going to have a lot of links to other people in the network. You might have a cook who's preparing food. You might have a medic that treats a lot of different people. You might have a courier who's carrying packages from one end of town to the other. You might have a journalist who's conducting interviews with as many members of the network as they can. But none of these people have done anything that makes them liable to be killed. So the risk is that we end up targeting people based on factors, based on data that don't really provide a moral justification for killing them. We start with a task that is totally admirable, identifying terrorists. We apply a method that seems neutral and objective, social network analysis. What we end up with is a system that's infected by subjective judgment and risks killing people who are not legitimate combatants. So what do we learn? Sometimes the way the technology is designed is itself problematic. It's not enough to show that you're engaged in an admirable project, but we have to also know the way that you're accomplishing that goal is not distorting the goal in the process. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is the social context in which we deploy our tools. We've seen over and over again that things that are designed for one purpose can take on a life of their own. This goes all the way back to Frankenstein. By the way, it's the 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein, as I'm sure you're all aware. I'm sure you marked your calendars.
I did.
Yeah. And often, in hindsight, this is totally foreseeable, right? We should have seen this coming. So there are two examples of this that I want to bring up. This picture looks like something out of Star Trek. It's in fact a picture from the early 1970s in Chile. After the socialist revolution in Chile, Pinochet comes to power. And they looked at the socialist experiments in the Soviet Union, where you'd have a bureaucracy at the very top of the country, and they would decide how much of a particular good they wanted to produce, socks or cars or seats or what have you. And then they would tell the factories exactly how many to produce. They would give them a quota. This was called a command economy from the top down. In Chile, they wanted to use a different model. They wanted to use socialism from the bottom up. So they created a very advanced, very futuristic information handling system that would allow factories to talk to each other, to coordinate their behavior. So they knew the supply of raw materials, they knew how much people were producing in the country, they knew where it was being shipped to, and so on. And they called this process cybernetic synthesis. For short, they called it CyberSyn. This is a picture of the control room, the central clearinghouse where this information passed through. So it was an experiment in socialism from below, and the idea was to collect logistics information for the factories and the other producers in the country, and to help them coordinate their behavior, to give power back to the workers so they could control the way that their work and the way that their lives were going. This was supposed to be the diametric opposite of the way the Soviet Union ran its economy. However, what we find is that CyberSyn's moment of truth came in October of 1972 when it was used to suppress a strike. You have 40,000 workers striking in the capital, and the people that were in charge of CyberSyn, the people that had access to all of the logistical information in the country, were able to use that information to subvert the strike. They were able to use that planning and those coordination abilities to direct 200 trucks to subvert the 40,000 workers that were striking. That's a tremendous negation, a denial of the democratic power of these 40,000 workers. Think about it this way. They're outnumbered 200 to 1, 40,000 against 200. That means if you were one of the strikers, if you were trying to protest for your rights, you would have to bring more than 200 people to the strike for every one person that opposed you. Forget democracy as a tallying of votes. Forget 50% plus one. We're talking now a concentration of power where you could be outnumbered 200 to 1. You could have half of 1% of the population on your side and you get your way. What's the lesson? The technology built to empower workers was turned against them in the hands of the powerful. Once you create these tools, once you turn them over to the powerful, what often happens is that they use them to cement their control. I'll give you another example that is closer to home. After World War I, the militaries of the world put a lot of thought and a lot of capital into redoing their military strategies. The United States spent a lot of time and energy thinking about air warfare. And they came up with a plan. The plan was the B-17 Flying Fortress. The idea was this: take a bomber, strap a bunch of armor to it so that it can penetrate deeply into enemy airspace, it can avoid anti-aircraft fire, and then strap a bunch of guns on it. Give it like 7 or 9 or 13 guns so that it can even fight off any fighters that challenge it in the air above the enemy territory. Now, as the war progresses, we find that the B-17 is not nearly as impervious to aircraft fire as we had hoped. The solution is to fly it from a higher altitude. But what that means is that its bombs are going to be less accurate in turn. What's the solution? Drop more bombs. We end up with a situation where the 50-50 radius of dropping a bomb from this plane was 3 miles. Now, I meant to look up a map and do this before I got here, but I suspect your campus is less than 6 miles in diameter. Which means if you were aiming for this building, you dropped a bomb aiming for this building, there's a 50% chance the bomb wouldn't even fall on campus. Now, if that's the accuracy of your weapons, you cannot hope to prosecute a war by aiming at refineries or ball-bearing factories or railroad yards or the other kinds of targets that have military value. What's the United States do? Well, they say, we can't aim for individual buildings anymore, but we're pretty good at aiming at a city's general location. And that becomes the policy by the end of the war. The explicit policy of the United States and the other allies was to aim for city centers, to aim for civilian populations. What does this tell us? There's a huge difference between a tool's intended purpose and what it does best and what it will ultimately be used for. So we couldn't use the B-17 for what we originally hoped. By the end of the war, we end up using it to intentionally bomb civilians. It's another great case of how technologies are not merely neutral, but instead they have a kind of inertia. They can take on a life of their own. They can dictate the policy. When you consider the context of these machines, that's not terribly surprising. And then my olive branch extended across the aisle. Look, regardless of your political party, you don't have to go very far back in history before you find an example of the military doing something that you disagree with. People on the right and the left have reason to be suspicious of the motives and the activities of the military. If you're in the shoes of an engineer, that's one of the things that you should consider. Even when these results are not foreseeable, they do require, I think, a healthy dose of caution. So what's my ultimate thesis? Engineers are partly morally responsible for what they enable. Now, I think that a lot of people have an asymmetry in their mind. A lot of engineers are happy to accept praise for the positive effects that they enable. But at the same time, they would shy away from the suggestion that they bear responsibility or that they deserve blame or criticism for the negative things that they enable. But I don't think that that asymmetry is defensible. Now, we're talking about these issues, and the examples that I've used and the stories that I showed you at the very beginning of this talk, they're all from the last couple of weeks. But this is not a new problem. Go all the way back to Republic, Plato's Republic, 380 BC. In the first book of Republic, Socrates says, he's trying to investigate the nature of justice, the nature of moral goodness. And someone says justice is giving back what you're owed, paying back your debts, and keeping your promises. And Socrates says, all right, here's an example. Suppose your neighbor gives you a sword to take care of, like his favorite sword, while he goes away on vacation. And you say, sure, I'll take care of this, I'll give it back to you when you get back. Your neighbor returns from their trip, and they've clearly gone insane. And they come back to you, they bang on your door in this murderous rage, and they demand to have their sword back, and they tell you that they're about to go kill so-and-so. Socrates says, is it the right thing to do to give this person back their sword? The answer seems obviously not. So what do we learn from this? Now, you have some reason to give the sword back. It belongs to them. You're keeping something that belongs to them. But Socrates still says there's a very serious concern here. The concern for enabling injustice. Notice what Socrates doesn't say. Socrates doesn't say, well, look, a sword is a neutral tool, and it's up to my neighbor to decide what they do with it. Socrates says no. And to put his lesson in language that's more contemporary, I think this is what he would say. When we give tools that enable violence to people whose motives we have good reason to suspect, we wrongfully enable unjust behavior. That's why it's wrong to give a sword to your neighbor. That's why a lot of people are criticizing Silicon Valley companies for working with the Pentagon. You're giving the tools of violence to people who we can be very confident are going to do bad things with them.
How about giving billions of dollars of weapons to Saudis?
They would give an analogous argument against that too, I imagine. Yeah. I want to consider a couple objections quickly. This is a fairly sophisticated objection. Suppose you said, well, look, if helping the Pentagon is an action, then choosing not to help is an action too. And so if I refuse to help the Pentagon, then I'm responsible for the effects of not helping. Suppose some other country that's less scrupulous develops the same weapons and we lose some kind of national strategic advantage to them. Sure, that's a fair point. That's an important question. The response, though, from me is, probably not. There's probably an important moral distinction between what you do and what you allow to happen. This is controversial among philosophers, but I think that this makes a lot of sense for people who are not philosophers. Consider what this would mean in your general life, for example. Think of all the things that you're enabling, or all the things that you're allowing to happen right now. People are dying in the third world of easily curable diseases. Little old ladies are trying to walk across the street in Sonoma. You're not right there helping them. Right? These are things that you're allowing to happen right now. But do we really think that you're as blameworthy for that as you would be as if you made these things happen? Almost certainly not. And I think that the engineering profession can allow this doing-allowing distinction into their education, into their ethical curriculum, and into their conception of themselves. So first of all, theory is really demanding, right? To think that you're responsible for what you allow to happen, what that means is, at any given moment, you should be thinking about the most important thing you could possibly be doing right now, and you have to go do it, or else you're going to be criticized. That seems really implausible. Secondly, it annihilates this idea that engineers have a special responsibility in society. It annihilates the idea that they have certain roles, they have a place to play in society, because it makes their moral obligations equivalent to your own. And I think that a lot of engineers are going to find that implausible. So I think that they can avoid that. Another objection, my second objection, I only have two, says that engineers have this special responsibility to help the Pentagon. And I think this is what Jeff Bezos was saying. America's a great country, it needs to be defended, ... The conclusion is that engineers are the people to defend it. That might be true for some things. But there are a lot of things in warfare, and autonomous weapons are one of them, that a lot of people think are probably evil in themselves. The word we use is mala in se. You can leave it to philosophers to come up with a Latin term for something that's perfectly coherent in English. Evil in itself. Philosophers prefer to use mala in se. The idea is that some weapons and methods shouldn't be used no matter what. Michael Walzer, a famous military ethicist, hugely influential military ethicist, said, "If the only way that you can win a war is by committing an atrocity, then you're not morally permitted to win the war." Take something like genocide, for example. Most military ethicists, probably all of them, accept that genocide is mala in se. It's impermissible no matter what. Even if the only way you can win a war is by committing a genocide, you're not permitted to do it. This is why it was probably wrong for, in the 30s and 40s, IBM to work with the Nazi regime very closely to help them develop punch cards that they used to take a census and tabulate the population of Jews in Germany. Now, maybe some of them didn't know what they were working on, but a lot of them did. Not just the people at the top, but also people that worked with the Nazi regime to make sure that the punch cards were formatted and designed in the way that was most efficient for what the Nazis were using them for. Every concentration camp, every major concentration camp in Germany had its own IBM tabulation machine. Now, do we think that the engineers working on this project could say, look, a punch card's just a piece of cardboard. It's just a neutral tool. You can use it to take a census of all the people in Sonoma. Or you can use it to take a census of all the Jews in Germany. It doesn't make a difference. It's up to the people that buy them to decide what they do with them. I suspect we would not find that a very compelling defense. Why is that? Because they have developed a tool that enables violence and they've turned it over to someone whose motives they have reason to suspect. And they have good reason to think that they're using it for something that's impermissible no matter what. They're using it to assist in genocide. A lot of people think autonomous weapons are evil in themselves. And it's not even clear that they could be used permissibly in any situations. I can talk about that more in the Q&A if you'd like. So if these weapons are wrong to use, then they've got to be wrong to create, because creating them only makes it more likely that they're going to be used. So what's my conclusion? Well, to take us back to the beginning of the talk, acting in good faith requires considering the social context that your tools are deployed into. Things are not always neutral. They can alter the goals that we in fact accomplish. Even tools for good can be misused in the hands of the powerful or people with a history of injustice. And finally, some things are evil in themselves and shouldn't be created no matter what. So if you're ever in this position, will you ask, what's this for? Who's going to use it? Who are they using it against? What mission or goal is it going to accomplish? And is the design of this tool fit for the job? Now that we know the design of technology is not merely neutral. The last thing that I want to say is that engineers are people who, by definition, want to make the world a better place. So I'm not here to slap hands and to tell you that engineers are morally bad people, or to storm the Google headquarters and say, you know, you guys are kind of like Nazis if you haven't thought about that. I don't think that would be a productive conversation, but I do think that philosophers and other humanities scholars have something to offer to this conversation. Namely, that there are ways of making the world better that engineers might have overlooked, and there are ways of making the world worse that they might neglect. Philosophers are people who have been thinking about how to make the world better and worse for going on 2,500 years now. We have some things we'd like to contribute. But I do think that ultimately, the way forward has got to be a collaborative endeavor between philosophers and people in the STEM professions, especially when it comes to hugely controversial issues like the one that we've just been talking about here. Thanks. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. 12:50, right? Is the
Yep, we got plenty of time for some questions.
Everyone's totally convinced. It's the only reasonable interpretation. Yeah.
As far as the can opener example at the beginning, you said it takes away the right and leaves us only with the left. Could it be argued also that all it does is give us the left with also the option to go for the right? You know, we still have farm-to-table restaurants. We still have these things that the tools that we have don't take away. It just adds the possibility of using the tools.
Good. So I do want to say something about this because, as a matter of fact, I was thinking about this example a little bit more, and there's something that I neglected to say, something that I should have said, which is that I think that you're exactly right. I think that your view is really plausible. But here's the worry that I'm trying to get at. The worry is that people might adopt that tool thinking it's neutral without realizing the kinds of ways that it changes their goal. So if you adopt a can opener, if you limited yourself, say, this would be an extreme case, but if you limited yourself only to canned food without realizing the way that it changes the food you take in, then you'd be making a mistake. You'd be making an epistemic mistake, a mistake about your beliefs and your justification for the beliefs that you have. So the real danger when people think that technology is neutral is that they'll overlook the way that it changes these outcomes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also have to remember that economic reality, if you are in a certain economic status, canned food is really your only option. You don't have that farm-to-table option because you can't pay $50 a person for dinner, right? And but you can pay 25 cents for a can of beans, right? So that's really what's going to you're going to force a certain group of people into the can opener world. And sure, rich people have an option, or middle class people have an option of doing either, but that's not the reality for most of the people.
Yeah, that's a better response. Yeah.
Would you say that most technologies are not neutral, or are there some that could be considered neutral and don't change their goal?
This is a really important question, and I've wanted to temper my view, to moderate my view as I make this point, because without sitting back and getting a comprehensive list of every technology and thinking about it carefully, I wouldn't commit to the view that every technology is perverts or changes the goals that you accomplish. I wouldn't deign to say that. I think that the technologies that are really, well, I think a lot of the technologies that are most influential and widespread in society are not neutral, and I think that's why philosophers of technology are often pounding their fist about this point. Look at something like the automobile, look at something like computers or the internet. You could say similar things about all of those. They drastically change the texture of our society, the things that we're able to do or likely to do, and the things that we're unable to do, or the kinds of activities that become less common for us. So I think that there's a reason why philosophers have spent a lot of time talking about those more popular, widespread technologies. The can opener example I like because it's so mundane, and it's the kind of thing that people would overlook with the thought that it's totally innocuous or neutral. Yeah, I'd have to think more to think about a technology that is, totally purely neutral, but I'm sure they're out there. It might even be the majority of technologies. But the ones that are not neutral are significant enough, widespread enough, and have important enough consequences that they deserve a lot of attention. You had your hand up, right? You're good?
Okay, yeah. These autonomous weapons are obviously going to cost a lot of money. It's foreseeable then that superpowers like the United States could afford an autonomous army or weapon systems that then removes a human aspect from warfare. So I can foresee the United States having a completely autonomous army fighting a completely humanized army, and at that point our risk changes because we're not actually risking human lives, and yet we're engaging in warfare. I'm wondering about some of the ethical implications of that, and does that just get tossed up to the more advanced army wins, or does that it's changing the face of warfare and what that means?
It's definitely changing the face of warfare, but you've seized on one of the camps in this debate that has a very powerful, very intuitively appealing argument, which is autonomous weapons will reduce risk to American soldiers or save American lives, and for that reason, it's obvious that it's morally required that we adopt them. Now, this is why you find people pushing the mala in se point, because they say, if the weapon is intrinsically evil, then it does not matter whether you could save lives by using it, because it's never permissible to use, period. A lot of people, this debate kind of parallels the debate over nuclear weapons. So it's easy to imagine a case where using a nuclear weapon to end a war actually reduces the total number of casualties from that point going forward, right? But the response is, nuclear weapons are mala in se, they're evil in themselves, it's never permissible to burn to death tens of thousands of civilians in their sleep, regardless of what else is on the line. So you find this stark divide between ethicists on exactly this question. And I think that the military ethics profession and the international humanitarian law community is going to have to answer they're going to have to grapple with some very significant questions that go to the bedrock of their discipline. The Red Cross, for example, or international humanitarian lawyers, should they think that the law functions to reduce the number of civilians who are killed in war? Or should we think that even if autonomous weapons would protect civilians and would also protect soldiers, would reduce the number of soldiers killed in war, that there's something that's so intrinsically problematic about them that they're still wrong to use? Now, this debate is excruciatingly difficult, and it's difficult because it parallels a deeper debate in moral philosophy that's at least 250 years old. And we're still working out that one. And the implications of that debate are going to have to inform the way that we think about autonomous weapons. But these are the two groups that we have. Should we think warfare is about reducing the number of people who are killed overall? Or should we think that there are some things that are so heinous, so disrespectful? In the words of one author, they would turn warfare into pest control, right? To your point about changing the nature of war. They turn the enemies into vermin, and they turn warfare into pest control. But there's something so deeply troubling about that they're impermissible, even if they save the number of lives that are lost. That's a hard question, but that's how the landscape looks. Time for one more, baby? Yeah.
So you ended with kind of like saying that humanities and like the engineering side should collaborate together to make these autonomous weapons. But what does that mean, kind of? Like, is that sort of giving engineers like a philosophy class requirement before they get their degree, or is it?
I think it means at least that. I think it means at least requiring some sort of, maybe not a philosophy class, but an ethics class. I should say an ethics class in a philosophy department, or taught by someone with credentials in philosophy. Because philosophers think very differently about these questions than someone outside of the humanities would. But I was even asking for something more profound than that. And I think that there's a model elsewhere in ethics that gives us a really inspiring model to look at, and that's the model of bioethics. So in, I think, the 60s and 70s, doctors became alarmed at the kinds of studies that they were running, the kinds of studies that were being published, and the things that doctors were doing with or without their patients' consent. And you find in the early 70s, philosophers poking their heads into the medical profession and saying, look, we've been thinking about questions of ethics for thousands of years, and you're doing some things that are very seriously wrong. Questions about euthanasia, for example. Questions about consent or do not resuscitate orders or something like that. And in the 70s, you literally find ethicists shadowing doctors in hospitals, following them on their daily rounds, understanding the kinds of problems that they face, and then helping them think about those problems or helping them work through them. And out of that, we had a tremendous blossoming of knowledge that created the bioethics discipline very recently. It's a huge success story. And I would love to see something like that take place in engineering ethics. I'd love to see literally a collaboration between philosophers and engineers, where you have them working together on a daily basis so that the two of them can understand their worlds better. There's a famous lecture delivered in the early 50s called The Two Cultures. And the idea was the STEM people live in one society, the philosophers and the humanitarians live in the other, and they don't talk to each other enough. We have the same problem today, 66 years later after those lectures were given. And I'd love to see us start bridging that gap proactively.
Excellent. That is a perfect place to stop. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.